Mr. President, for a few moments, I wish to lend my support to the measure before this chamber this afternoon. Let me preface by advising Senator Adams that no, I will not address anything relative to the commercial banks in this country. I think that the Court of Public Opinion will make a decision shortly on their operations here. Let me, however, draw on that very familiar saying, if it is not broken, there's no need to fix it. And that is a saying that I'm sure all of us in this chamber are familiar with. If it is not broken, you don't fix it. The reality is, though, that our task this afternoon in addressing this bill is because it is broken. It is broken. It is not, in my view, operated as I think the architects would have intended it to. And so, as a result of that, there's a need for us now to fix it. And we will do so via repealing the bill. And I believe that I heard the Minister of Industry in the other place speak to the fact that at some point it is his ministry's intention of replacing it. So we will repeal today, all things being equal, with an understanding that it will be replaced because there is a need to address the constituents that such a piece of legislation would have been intended and serving. So why is it that we want to repeal, or why is it that we need to repeal? We heard already today the issue of the OECD and other Bretton Woods institutions and what is happening on the international scene, and I suspect that maybe other senators may continue that dialogue. I want to focus more specifically in my short presentation on what I consider to be a more practical side, and that is the implication for our business sector, our business community here in Barbados. We understand and we agree that when Sir Arthur Lewis developed his model and introduced his model of industrialization by invitation back then, and it was embraced by many of our Caribbean economies, 60s and 70s and onward, that this piece of legislation may have found its genesis and its justification. Someone already said in this chamber that it seemed to have been intended more so for those international companies seeking to do business here in Barbados. But the question for me is, why are we repealing it? Because we determine the usefulness of a piece of legislation. We determine its impact on access and utility. The ability for constituents to access the provisions in the piece of legislation, the ability of the intended constituents to utilize the provisions in the legislation. Mr. President, I suggest and I opine that these things will determine the effectiveness of the legislation. So if we use that as the acid test, the access and utility, then I would have to suggest that this piece of legislation failed. These are my thoughts this afternoon. It failed. Why am I saying so, Mr. President? Senator Drake's earlier asked for data. The data suggests that within the last 4 years, just 4 years, let's look at the last four-year time period, there were 4 companies, Mr. President, only 4 companies that actually applied under this piece of legislation and were granted approval to be able to access the provisions. 4 in the last 4 years alone. And I am sure that when you look at the information, the data would suggest that even prior to the last 4-year period, this has been the trend. There's not been a lot of uptake from the business community. And it begs the question, why? Why is that the case? Especially at a time when we look at the data, I would refer to our survey of the small business sector back in 2016, commissioned by us and executed by the Salisis UWI. This survey, which is available, all members, I would suggest you can go on our website, my association's website, and download a copy if you've not yet done so. This survey had indicated that there are approximately 9,600 formal enterprises operating in Barbados. 9,651 to be precise. Formal enterprises operating in Barbados. Micro, small, medium, and large. Well, large by the definition in here. We all know that a large firm by our definition in Barbados is a small firm based on global standards. But based on this data, Mr. President, some 10% of the formal businesses operating in Barbados, 10%, are in the manufacturing sector. So it begs the question, you can do the math, with 9,600 odd formal firms, 10% of them being manufacturers. How can we only have 4 firms within the last 4 years or so seeking to access the provisions of this legislation? So when I said earlier that you assess legislation based on access and utility, and based on that, this one failed. That alone, Mr. President, that alone can justify my reasoning. But let's look at the conditionalities. I believe the leader of government business this morning referenced some of this. The data indicates to us that a firm applying must meet a number of conditionalities. A technical assessment of the project covering the production process. They must also conduct an environmental impact assessment of the project. But the one that really boggles my mind is that this firm has to prepare an economic analysis of the compensation to the country for any loss of fiscal revenues. Now, pray tell the small business, the micro firm that is able to do that. Pray tell, Mr. President, the medium enterprise that is able to do that. I mean, the list goes on. I didn't quote all of them, but this speaks to a number of provisions that I opine are outside the remit of the average small and medium enterprise to meet. And therefore, it is no wonder that firms are not jumping through hoops to apply for the provisions in this piece of legislation. So there's no access. There is no utility. The question was asked earlier today if there's been any consultation with trade associations and so on relative to our efforts at repealing. You know, Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company in the US is known to have said that if he had asked his customers what they wanted back then, they would have said faster horses. But he understood that there are times that you have to make decisions in the interest of those whom you serve. And I think that that is the intention here this afternoon. Recognizing that there's not been the uptake, recognizing that the conditionalities are onerous, that there's a need for us to repeal and to replace. But the second point, Mr. President, I would wish to make is in the form really of a question. Why is it that so many different pieces of legislation that are intended to serve the business community, so many policies that are intended, I would hope, to benefit the business community, are not doing so. I think that is a bigger question for me. And I can speak, Mr. President, with some level of experience on this matter. Because being an administrator in the small business sector for some 15 years, I am very much aware that beyond this Fiscal Incentive Act, there's another piece of legislation that's not for debate now, but I'll reference it, Chair, to strengthen my point. The Small Business Development Act, first introduced in 1999, amended in 2006, also has several provisions for micro and small businesses to apply and to access approved small business status that would allow them as well to become more competitive. This is the intention, I would think, of these pieces of legislation, that firms can access the provisions to strengthen their competitiveness. To this day, Mr. President, there are not 100 approved small businesses in Barbados. Not 100. And I gave the number from our study of the formal businesses, but Mr. President, would you believe that of those firms, 9,651, the data from SALISYS suggests to us that 96.3% are micro, small, and medium enterprises. So if you do the math alone, 96.3%, and this, someone may say, but this sounds a lot. No, we did an assessment even in Jamaica, our neighbor, recently, and their figure was 97%. And we understand from our regional efforts that the numbers are very similar in the 90s across CARICOM. So if it is that we have so many firms operating, we have a piece of legislation that is intended to give them duty-free access, they can bring in equipment, they can pay lower in corporation tax, etc. Why is it that there is not then the uptake? Access and utility. So it tells me, Mr. President, that there's a need for us to address these issues, because we would want to ensure that our business community, and might I add, the micro and small business community more so, that is vulnerable, Mr. President. We heard the talk about the OECD and WTO, how they've been operating. I'm sure the argument will be that we as a small island development state, you know, we understand our vulnerability, and so we appreciate what we have to do to be able to comply. The same principle applies to the sector. The sector is a sector that the majority of firms operate in are micro, small, and medium, and therefore, by their very makeup, Mr. President, by the very composition of their operations, they are vulnerable. And so our legislation, our policies need to be developed in such a way and administered in such a way, Mr. President, that they benefit to the sector, that they can give the sector that leg up. So which takes me to my final point. What then should this replacement look like? If it is that we are going to repeal, and we understand and we agree that we must repeal for the simple reason that this one has not done what it was intended to. What should we be replacing it with? We heard some recommendations earlier about niche manufacturing. We heard recommendations relative to networks and partnerships and so on. And I quite agree that going forward, we have to maybe do business a little different to the past. This is no longer the 1960s, 1970s, where you sit with manufacturers sometimes, or they reminisce and they take you back to the 60s and 70s and so on. The reality is that the business environment has changed. The environment has changed. The cost of business now, the inputs to the operations of a business have increased exponentially. Not only that, we have a global competitor. I'm not going to call the name of this chamber, but I would challenge everyone to look at your possessions around this table, turn to the back of it, and see where is it made. And most of the things that you have in here today, you will see that the manufacturer is in a particular Asian market. Mr. President, this is just the reality of doing business today. The cost of business has gone up. The cost of inputs, utility costs, wages. We have union representatives in here, and they would always argue for their constituents' jobs to be secured. They would argue. Mr. President, I'm not going to offer an opinion if they justify the argument or not. I would simply say that they will argue, right? But the cost of labor, utilities, raw materials, certain commodities on the international market that we obviously have no control over, will make the production of goods in Barbados uncompetitive relative to our international markets. So then what should we be focusing on? I'm a strong advocate, Mr. President, that our small states, governments have to play a greater interventionist role so as to be able to protect vulnerable sectors. I believe that strongly. Those who will cite WTO rules and all that oftentimes fail to appreciate that some of the biggest markets protect key industries, agriculture and the like. They do it. And so we cannot be so timid not to appreciate that there are vulnerable groups in our business community that we have to protect, and therefore we need the legislative framework and the policy space to be able to do so. So, things like the UWI's Center for Entrepreneurship and Food Security, Mr. President, headed by Professor O'Gara, I believe I can call his name in this chamber, as I'm doing so in a positive light, is doing some good work. They have, as you know, a property in St. Thomas, and that they're rolling out a number of innovative ideas and so on to look at the issue of food security and how we can incentivize niche manufacturing. And that's what we need to focus on, niche areas, right? The focus on mass manufacturing is not sustainable based on the structure of business today. So niche areas. And therefore, whatever we can do as government in terms of providing the incentives, the policy space and so on, we need to ensure that that project can get off the ground sooner rather than later. The whole adage of producing a product first for your domestic space before you export is a thing of the past. There's a lot of data, a lot of research on the born global ideology, and so we can look at markets, at products, where we're using what limited resources we have here in Barbados and the Caribbean to develop brands for the export market. They can leapfrog the domestic space. You no longer have to just focus on your domestic space before you consider an export strategy in your business model. So you can leapfrog that. So we're suggesting, Mr. President, I am suggesting rather, that as we look to replace, let us be mindful of the changing environment, business environment that we are in, the cost of doing business, and therefore we need to have those niche areas that we can focus on. I know my colleagues at the Grant mentioned the pepper sauce and so on before, but even that, Mr. President, let's be honest. I have a situation where I know of a small firm got an order from Tesco in the UK, Mr. President, and struggled to be able to satisfy the order to the point I don't even think that they did. They maybe did half a container. After a while, they did half a container. The number of factors I think that contributed to that. But in reviewing it, my advice to that entrepreneur was, look, you cannot go at this alone. And that is the issue. We can no longer do it alone. You see, my colleague talked about movies, but I had like one name that featured a character called the Lone Ranger. I did him myself, no, Mr. President. Right? But the Lone Ranger concept stuck with me. The nomenclature, stuck with me. And I use it a lot to say to people, no, that might have been fine back then, but it's no longer good enough now. We can no longer do it alone. So the Lone Ranger approach to business is no longer justifiable. It's no longer effective. We need clusters. We need to create clusters. We need to create networks so that, yes, we can access the export markets. And this is where the organizations like the BIDC come in, because they ought to be their remit, therefore, to look to see how can we help these micro and small firms come together, contribute into the ideas, pull their skills, their strengths together, and create export brands that would allow us to find those niche areas. My mother used to say half a loaf is better than none. And that stuck with me. Half a loaf is better than no loaf at all. And so getting 10% of $1 million, Mr. President, is a lot more than me having 100% of 10. And that is the kind of attitudinal change and the kind of thinking that we need to go into any replacement legislation, that it has to encourage networking, it has to encourage pooling of resources, it has to encourage incentives for micro and small firms to be able to do business and do so competitively. We need to harness the resources of our government agencies to help with the building out of a new type of industry and manufacturing sector. It cannot be the manufacturing of the 60s and 70s. It just can't. The use of technology now has overtaken the efficiencies that we bring to how a business functions. And so, Mr. President, while I support the repeal of this bill, I'm asking for us, whenever we sit to look at it, let's look at the replacement and make sure that it is designed in such a way that it can enable business. Not be a deterrent, but it has to enable the operationalization and competitiveness of business in this country. So with those few words, Mr. President, I support the repeal. I look forward to the opportunity to maybe have a contribution to make on what the replacement ought to look like. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. I next recognize Senator Haynes.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I rise this afternoon to lend my voice in support of the repeal of this act. In a light moment over lunch, I was joking, telling one of my colleagues that as a physician, there are very few things that have come before us in the last 3 months that have fallen under the purview of my expertise, but I've always found joy in learning, and I can't wait to see how much I will learn over the next 5 years. So my brief submission this afternoon will focus on why this piece of legislation would have failed to deliver what I believe would have been the desired economic growth and sustained growth that the drafters of the legislation may have hoped for, and what we can aim to do in order to attract quality foreign direct investment in the era that we live in, where preferential trade agreements and taxation agreements are now being expunged. So firstly, we look at the context in which this act was developed. So I wasn't around back then, I wasn't even a thought, but in the early 1970s, I realized that there was a global economic recession that would have resulted from the OPEC crisis, and from a global commodity shortage. So at that time was around the time that CARICOM was formed, and there was something that was devised called the Harmonization of Fiscal Incentives to Industry scheme. Barbados became signatory to that in 1974, and so did many of our fellow neighbors. My first question was this the right scheme for Barbados? When I considered that island territories like Jamaica and Trinidad were rich in natural resources, oil and bauxite, you could see how a mechanism like this would attract major multinational corporations to help countries that were not even a decade out of independence to flash out their infrastructure to create employment opportunities. But Barbados' situation was a bit different. Resource limited. We could only really attract what I would describe as cottage industries. In my research, what I saw was that we were able to attract garment manufacturing, textiles, and small technological firms rather than the major investments that you would have seen at play in Jamaica and Trinidad. So my first question when I saw this was it the right fit for Barbados? How could we even try to match up to some of our peers? So anyhow, we went ahead and did it, giving corporations that entered the country major concessions in terms of being able to defer tax liability, given preferential tax treatment, special exclusions and exemptions. And what was interesting is that these exemptions applied for a period of up to 15 years, and at the discretion of the minister could be extended for a further 5 years. What my second question was were we able to evaluate whether what we were losing out on in terms of potential revenue generation, how was it balanced in terms of what these firms were giving back? So sure, there was a level of foreign direct investment and employment, but there was no real quantitative evaluation of the contribution made by these firms. So we weren't able to properly assess whether the direct or indirect benefits to the host economy were present. So I would say that the legislation in its form, when I looked at it, had failed to have the lasting and desirable developmental effects. So I read all 27 pages of the legislation, and I came up with a few points as to why this might have happened. Firstly, I noticed that there were no set conditions for the transfer of technology. There was no specific reference to for the exposure of local staff to management or supervisory roles. And this is something that would have been important in that when you expose, let's say, a seamstress to a supervisory or management level position, if that company should leave the island shores, then she might be in a position, let's say, to set up her own firm. There was also a lot of assessment on the impact in terms of local industries, local competitors. So a small local firm would not be likely to maintain a competitive advantage against a large multinational corporation. There was no specific reference to having to utilize local raw materials. Rather, we were actually incentivizing the importation of raw materials by zero rating some of the imports. Also, in the Barbadian context, we failed to attract some of the desired highly skilled sectors that would have generated a greater level of foreign direct investment for the country. And one of the additional negative